Welcome back, everybody. What we're going to be doing today is exploring the topic of social perception. And this discussion of social perception also marks the beginning of a journey into a new branch of psychology, one that we haven't necessarily mentioned a ton before, but one that is very popular in not only psychology in general, but lots of other areas that do work that relates to psychology. It's this branch of psychology that we call social psychology. What is social psychology? Well, in general, social psychologists attempt to try to understand what we're doing, thinking, feeling as a result of some of the different things that we encounter in our social world. Now, sometimes when social psychologists study these topics, they focus on the individual. Other times they could focus on the group or kind of the interaction between the group and the individual. And there's even a couple individuals in social psychology that have focused on differences that societies have created to have people actually react differently to the same situation across different cultures or different areas. It's a very broad-ranging, broad-ranging area of interest, and because of it, you see lots of things that are explored by social psychologists pop up in, as I mentioned before, other branches of interest. You'll sometimes see business researchers trying to understand social psychology topics better. You might see social psychology topics pop up in things like education or community outreach programs. In essence, when we try to understand why we're doing or thinking or feeling the things we're feeling due to the social factors, we can find these kind of questions applicable to a lot of different areas. So to try to tackle all of social psychology in just a few lectures would be very challenging. It's actually pretty challenging to do it in a social psychology class, let alone in just 2 or 3 lectures. So what I thought we'd do in this class and a couple of the other ones is just focus in on some very early and popular areas of interest, tying a lot of the concepts and terms that we're going to cover here to hopefully some more current stuff that you might encounter down the road. Essentially, we're just going to build a framework that you would need for future social psychology classes and also give you the terminology and the concepts that you would be expected to know leaving an intro class having learned a little bit about social psychology. So let's get started with that topic of social perception. Now, social perception research is an attempt to understand how we make sense of the world around us and what are the things that kind of shift those ideas or cognitions that we come up with. When we try to break down social perception on different levels, what we encounter is a large number of questions that are required to be answered for us to truly understand how our making sense of situations and others and ourselves actually comes about. We don't have time, even in an entire hour, to cover all the different areas that social perceptual psychologists explore, but what I thought we'd do is look at some of the early questions that people in the field of social psychology asked with respect to this topic, so we could see how these concepts were broken down and how a social psychologist would try to understand these very broad topics. We're going to look first at this question that popped up numerous years ago, and it's the question of when we start to form perceptions of the world around us. And let's say we hypothetically walk into a new classroom. We see another student. When is it that you decide something about the student's behavior? Maybe blaming them or the situation. Or when is it that you decide about certain characteristics of the person that you're watching? Is it instantaneous? Does it take days, weeks? Is there a certain number of encounters where we start to see you passing this threshold? This was the type of stuff asked by early psychologists in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s as the field started to grow. But they weren't the only questions relating to social perception that were being asked. Another one was, how are we going about creating these interpretations of the situation and the person? And are we doing these things not only for groups, but maybe for other, sorry, for individuals, but also for groups, and maybe even ourselves? This is the type of stuff that we're going to try to break down in this lecture. And we're going to start with that first question. When do we form perceptions? When do we make judgments about others or the situation? I'm guessing many of you right now are trying to guess. Is it a couple days, a couple weeks, a couple minutes, or are we pretty instantaneous in it? And I'm also guessing that some of you have come to the conclusion that many early psychologists came to. And that conclusion is, despite the fact that many of us like to think of ourselves as very thoughtful, as people that wouldn't judge people very quickly and wouldn't, I guess, come to conclusions before they should, more often than not, in social psychology research, we tend to find that most of us, when encountering social situations, often commit something called the primacy effect, where we very, very quickly rush to judgments about others, about situations, about what's going on. And that rush to judgment that we have can potentially be changed, but it carries a lot of weight with us throughout the rest of our experience with either that person or situation or kind of things that we're making these judgments about. And this primacy effect, which is a term that we've talked about before in cognitive psychology, has kind of a different tint to it when we look at it from a social psych perspective. It talks not only about how we remember those things that we encounter first with a person or a situation, but how those things have a way of kind of tinting the way we see future encounters with those people or situations. Let's say, for example, you meet somebody and find them very funny right off the bat. Well, it means that they're going to have to do a lot to kind of dissuade you from being convinced that they're funny, even if they're not necessarily the most humorous person in the world. That first impression really matters. A classic example of people recognizing this intuitively, even if they aren't social psychologists, relates back to something that many parents do with their children when they're going to school for the very first day of the year. Obviously, this year was slightly different from most years, but more often than not, when parents send their kids off to school, what they tend to do is dress them up, tell them to be on their best behavior, tell them to be super nice to their instructors, and it might lead you to ask, well, what's the insistence on this? Maybe you had parents that did this for you as well. There's some logic to it. There's actually a really good reason why parents make their children behave this way and dress up and do all the things that they do on the first day of class. Numerous studies have shown that if teachers find children to be desirable or kind of delightful on the first couple days where they're engaged, they're kind of pleasant, those teachers can shift their perceptions of these kids and in microscopic ways start to treat them in a way that tends to help them do better in school later on. And this relates to another topic that we look at that kind of is involved in the primacy effect called self-fulfilling prophecies. It gives us kind of an understanding why these early assumptions have so much, we can call it oomph. So when we try to start to make sense of somebody and we decide they are a certain way, well, we start to treat them in a way that acts in accordance with our expectations. And when we're treating somebody in a specific way, well, that can get them to follow with behaviors that sometimes, actually more often than not, align with our expectations. One of the studies that I love to cite in this intro class that highlights how powerful these self-fulfilling prophecies can be is actually one that I talk about in my social psychology course that I teach that was actually done back in 1977 by a trio of researchers named Snyder, Tank, and Bershine. In this study, they invited college students that they insisted needed to be either heterosexual male or female participants to come in and participate in what they argued was a phone conversation study, where they tried to convince students that they were really interested in just understanding the dynamics between heterosexual males and females when they talk for the first time, especially if they don't know much about each other. So they'd bring these men and women in, tell them that they were going to go to a room after hearing all the instructions, sit down at a table, and have a phone conversation with somebody that they'd never met from their campus. They told them that they were not allowed to talk about what they looked like or anything like that, and the conversation should just be on random topics. But they warned them that they would be recording them and just using their recordings and their information for the kind of future analysis that they were going to do on this project. They then did bring everybody to their respective rooms where they had telephones, not cell phones. Mind you, this was 1977. Cell phones were not around at that time. And then they told the males that they were going to get a number and they were going to call this number that was to the other line where there was going to be a female waiting for them. They told the females pretty much the same thing, except for the fact that they said that you were going to get a call. And then they left the females sort of on their own and went back to the males and told them one last thing before they were about to call. They told all of the males that they'd encountered some problems in some of the early portions of the experiment. They had noticed that there was some discomfort when people didn't know who they were talking with, and they felt like trying to find a way to ease this discomfort might help with their data analysis. So they told the males that they were going to sneak into the room of the female that they were talking with, snap a picture of them, and after snapping a picture of them, they would bring it back and show it to the males so they could at least see who they were talking with. But they insisted to these males that they were not supposed to mention that they had seen a picture of the female. They said it would ruin the data, and again, they were not supposed to talk about looks, so it really could not be a component to the conversation. So they left the room and came back and gave the males one of two pictures, neither of which happened to be of the female that they were about to talk with. It was either a picture of a female that was rated on most standards as fairly attractive or a female that was rated on most standards as fairly unattractive. Right? And I know that seems pretty shallow, but social psychologists can actually, through different algorithms, we have a whole class on it in the social psychology course, figure out which types of faces are actually considered very attractive to most people and which ones are considered not attractive to most individuals. So obviously there's going to be some individual differences that they encountered in this study, but for the most part, they wanted to try to ensure that they were going to give males either an attractive face that they were believing they were going to talk with or an unattractive one. And then the experiment started. The males called the females and they had this conversation. And as most of you probably would expect right off the bat, the males did behave differently depending upon the face of the person that they thought they were looking at. They were more flirtatious with the more attractive female. They were more open. They talked about potentially getting together. They did all the things that males do when they're impressed with a female. At least heterosexual males do when they're impressed with a female. At least usually do, I guess we could say. And, that was not necessarily surprising. That wasn't even the point, really, of the study. What Snyder, Tank, and Burscheid wanted to see was how this treatment impacted the females. So they did actually record the conversation, and after the conversation was done, they deleted the male side of the conversation and had only a female talking to some unknown individual about random topics. They brought this recording of a female talking to some random unknown person and had independent listeners listen to the female side of the conversation and ask them something kind of odd. They said, we know it seems kind of out of context, but if you could, can you rate the attractiveness of the females just based on what they're saying? How attractive do you think they are, say, on a scale of 1 to 10? And what they found in this study was that the females that had been paired up with the attractive picture were rated as much more attractive by these independent raters than those that were paired up with the unattractive picture. And that's a pretty powerful effect, right? These females had no idea that somebody had seen what they thought was a picture of them and was treating them in a specific way, but their behaviors in this study started to align pretty quickly with the expectations that had been placed on them. This is exactly what we tend to see with the primacy effect and self-fulfilling prophecies in multiple situations. People judge others based on what they look like, what they're going to do, and because they make those judgments, they start to treat them in a specific way, oftentimes leading to those people to conform to those expectations that are being placed on them. And this idea of attractive people acting a specific way and being treated a specific way leads us to another really important topic that's talked about in social psychology. It's this idea of something that we call stereotypes. When we don't just make an assessment about somebody based on something they do, but maybe an assessment about somebody based on the group that they're a part of. Stereotypes, by definition, are generalized beliefs that we hold about members of a group simply because they're a part of that group. Now, in social psychology research, some people do focus on not only negative stereotypes, but also positive stereotypes associated with groups. More often than not, once we go outside of social psychology, people tend to focus their attention on the negative stereotypes and the effects that they have. But there are some researchers that have looked at how maybe positive expectations on somebody can push them in the right direction or be stressful in certain situations if you're not necessarily aligning with those positive stereotypes that are placed on you. But when we look at stereotypes and the positive or negative nature to it, the thing that we often focus on in research is the things that follow from it. If we're talking about the attitudes that come from our stereotypes, we're looking at something called prejudice. This kind of unusually negative or positive or neutral, but more often than not negative attitude that we carry toward a member of a group simply because they're a part of that group. Oftentimes, these prejudices that we have align with certain stereotypes that we form about groups. So if we see a group of individuals as more aggressive than others, or I don't know, more funny than others, whatever it is, we're usually, when we're doing this, feeling good or bad about those people based on those stereotypes that we have. And oftentimes, if we start to have attitudes and assume certain things about individuals, the other thing that inevitably follows is this thing called discrimination, where we treat members of a specific group unfairly based on the stereotypes that we hold about them. Again, technically, in social psychology, discrimination can be positive, but more often than not, people in the field focus on the negative discrimination that people can display and how that negative discrimination impacts members of those groups that are commonly discriminated against. And it's really important to note that in social psychology, when we're talking about these things, it's not always differentiated between the accurate versus the inaccurate stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination that people display. Usually when we talk about it in the real world and in big picture things, it's on the stereotypes that are extremely unfair. Ones that relate to gender, race, sexual orientation, all of these different things that are kind of hot topic items across the world, really, are the things that many social psychologists focus on. But there are a few that focus on the kind of benefits of the kind of day-to-day stereotypes we have. Say, for example, somebody wearing a jumpsuit, carrying a mop and a bucket, walking through the halls of a giant school might be perceived as somebody that could be defined as a janitor, and might be perceived as somebody that probably is good at cleaning things and knowing how to unlock doors and doing all these other things. Well, technically, when you see somebody wearing those clothes and you activate these ideas that that person fits into that grouping, that's you using a stereotype. It obviously does not have the same connotation as when you look at the color of somebody's skin or their height or their weight or something like that and immediately assume all these things about them. That's when stereotypes can start to become extremely problematic. But what many social psychologists have contended is we might just be naturally inclined to stereotype because of the situations where these things are useful. We in the field have tried to understand, where these things come about, especially the destructive ones. One particular researcher, well, I guess we could call her a researcher, well, one particular individual, we'll say, that really highlighted how easy it can be to devise these very destructive, mean, and completely irrational stereotypes was actually a third grader from a very small school in Riceville, Iowa, named Jane Elliott, who ran this study that originally became a video called The Eye of the Storm. It's a relatively old black and white, I think it was actually converted into color film, that depicted this study where she suggested to her students that the color of their eyes was a very big indicator of intelligence. And she suggested on one day that all blue-eyed children were significantly smarter and more advanced than others, and just wanted to see how that would get all of the blue-eyed children to treat the brown-eyed children in their class. And then on the second day, she would flip the switch and tell them that she was actually wrong the first day, that it was actually brown-eyed children that were superior. And she wanted to see how an authority figure teaching kids about these stereotypes and trying to kind of coax it out of them would get them to treat each other within just this time frame of a single day. She also wanted to look at how people being stereotyped against could be impacted by this, and how these things could maybe, when we start to point them out, strengthen our understanding of ourselves and how we want to be cautious about these things. She actually ended up making a career out of this, and there were several videos that were created to kind of re-look at this original Eye of the Storm video that she created. One that I used to show in class was something called A Class Divided, but there is some language in it that is definitely uncomfortable. There's some kids, this is rural Iowa in the 1980s when this film was made, actually it's 1970s I think when this film was made, and they definitely use some terms that are extremely offensive, and it's definitely odd to hear a little kid, I think this was a, well, 8-year-old kid, say these things. But the message is pretty powerful. So if you are interested in looking at this more, you can read about it in the text, or there is a video called A Class Divided that you can actually download or watch online. And it's very telling, and it really highlights the complexity of stereotypes and how they can really have a detrimental impact on individuals that have them applied to them, especially when they're unfairly applied and they're about things that are very important to our psyche and our definition of who we are. And this brings us to another really important topic. In the beginning of this class, when we were talking about social perception, we mentioned that we oftentimes commit this thing called the primacy effect when we're making sense of others and a situation around us. What happens if, say, we look at a situation and decide that the situation is not really something we can use to make sense of another person, but more just the situation itself? Well, this relates to another really critical topic in social perception that we call attributions. The attempt to understand and assign cause to the things that we're seeing. And if we want to simplify things, what researchers say we could do when making attributions in situations is either blame a situation on the person that's acting or the environment that that person is acting in. In essence, make what we call internal or external attributions for a situation we encounter. Now, obviously, there's probably more gray zones in most situations where it's a combination of the person and the situation, but nonetheless, when people studying attributions look at this idea, they do often ask, what type of an attribution are you making when you see somebody doing something like, say, failing an exam? Are you making an internal attribution where you assume that their failing of that exam is related to their skills or their motivation levels, or how they're just a very exhausted person and not able to push themselves, I guess we could say? Or are they're external factors that are the problem? Right? Was there not enough time for them to take the exam? Did the teacher do something to this person? Were the questions too challenging for this person who wasn't able to pass an exam? Well, this question was actually something that we first tried to devise or understand from a mathematical standpoint. And there was actually a model called the covariation model that was introduced. It suggested we could ask a series of different questions and come up with a conclusion based on the answers to those questions about whether or not we should make an internal or an external attribution. There were lots of people that gave all of these hypothetical ways that we could be better explainers of the world around us. The only problem is, as we were doing this, as we were trying to come up with the best models to explain why people did the things they did, Social psychologists were continually discovering that most of us never approach this topic of making attributions in a logical way. More often than not, we would commit something that used to be called the fundamental attribution error, something that's now oftentimes referenced as the correspondence bias, where when we see somebody acting, we don't ask a series of questions, we don't weigh all the different things that could push people in different directions, and instead just assume that somebody's actions is almost always dictated by some type of internal attribution. They're smart, or they're not so smart, or they're funny or not funny, as personality or enduring characteristic qualities that we talked about. And not only is this something that pretty much everybody does, but what fundamental attribution error researchers have found is that this is oftentimes something we do even when it seems obvious to even everybody around us that we should be making an external attribution for the behaviors that we're viewing. And one of the classic studies that highlighted how powerful this effect could be was one that invited college students to come in and write an essay about a very controversial individual in the 1960s named Fidel Castro. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with the history of Fidel Castro, just understand that he was a very polarizing individual in the United States when his regime in Cuba engaged in some, well, debatable actions. I don't want to upset anybody on either side of the Castro debate, but understand that in the 1960s there were a lot of people that were kind of heated on the topic of Cuba, Castro, and how the United States should be interacting with this individual and the country. So Jones and Harris invited people to come in, again, write essays about Castro, but they weren't asked to just write any essay. They came in, sat with a whole group of individuals, and Jones and Harris split the class in half, or split the group in half. They told half the participants, in front of everybody else, your task for this activity is to write an essay about why Fidel Castro is a very horrible individual and why we should not be celebrating or embracing this person. They told the other half of the participants that their job was to write an essay about why Fidel Castro was a wonderful individual and why we should be celebrating him as a person. Now, not only did they tell everybody that that's what they were needed to do, but they then insisted to everybody before they wrote the essays that it was important that they let their own feelings go by the wayside during this experiment. So we don't care if you were forced to write a negative essay about Castro and you actually love him, or vice versa. Your job to earn credit for this study is to follow those instructions. Make sure you follow them to the letter. And then people would write their essays, and as we usually find in social psychology research, almost everybody complied to those instructions. There were very few people that wrote a pro essay if they were asked to write a con essay. Almost everybody stayed in their lanes, did exactly what they were told to do, and they submitted their essays. And then Jones and Harris did another really interesting thing. They shuffled the essays and redistributed them to everybody that was participating in the study. And they said, well, what we want you to do for the final bit of this study is assess this essay that you're reading and guess how much the person who wrote this essay likes or dislikes Fidel Castro. And they said something along the lines of, you probably can tease out a couple statements here and there and really get a sense of how they're feeling, even if you know that they were forced to write this. So people would look through the writings and parse out a few things and come up with some estimate of how much somebody liked or disliked Fidel Castro. And then they would report their estimates from, I think, a scale of 1 to 10 to the class or to the group that was participating. And what they found was that almost everybody forced to write a negative Fidel Castro essay was assumed to really dislike Fidel Castro. And everyone who was forced to write a positive Castro essay was assumed to really like Fidel Castro. And this seems odd if you think about it. They just randomly split this group up in half. And nonetheless, even though these people were forced to write these essays that were pro or negative, realizing that, that this could be a situation where the instructions were the only thing that caused people to write what they wrote, people still overwhelmingly assumed that all the pro-Castro essay writers loved Castro and all the anti-Castro essay writers hated Castro. A kind of strong indication of how powerful this fundamental attribution there is. That even if we're forced to do something, we assume that the actions of others is a byproduct of themselves. And this is something that we found year after year, decade after decade in the United States. But what makes this story even more interesting is the fact that in the 1990s, we discovered that this thing that we had called fundamental was indeed not fundamental. There were groups within our world, within the United States, sorry, there were groups on Earth, there we go, that didn't actually behave in this manner. There was a researcher at UC Berkeley at the time who also worked with a researcher down at Stanford named Michael Morris. This researcher's name was, at UC Berkeley, was Kai-Ping Peng. And he ran all of these different studies to show that people from East Asian societies, primarily China and Japan was the focus on his research originally, actually did not commit this fundamental attribution error. When they were asked to explain the actions of people, they often focused on the situational factors, the things that led up to the behavior, and very rarely did they blame something happening on an enduring characteristic of the person that was acting. There's a video that out there, if you want to look for it, where he talks about this study where he had a fish separating out from the group. In the US, most of us focus on the fish itself. How the fish had these characteristics that led it to want to separate from the group. Where in most Asian cultures, there's this interpretation of the situation in a very different way, where the fish moved away from this single fish because there was some situational factor that kind of prevented them from wanting to be around that fish anymore. Essentially, there was a focus in this what we call collectivist culture on the group as a whole and the environment, not the individual or not any assumptions about the individual characteristics of the fish acting. This series of kind of studies that Peng devised in the 1990s became the catalyst for a whole collection of cultural psychology research that spanned well beyond this fundamental attribution error. But it was, if we're just looking at it in this context, this really brilliant insight into how this thing that we consider fundamental might actually be learned. We had other support for this thing being learned long before Peng's work. And this evidence comes in the form of an effect that social psychologists call the actor-observer effect, where we, when judging our own behaviors, no longer have a tendency to make internal attributions, and instead, more often than not, especially for negative or neutral things, tend to assume that the causes of our behaviors are external in nature or related to the situation. One of the classic studies that showed how important this actor-observer effect was one that was done by a pair of researchers named Jones and Nesbitt in 1970, where they asked people to come in, write down their own names, write down the names of a family member. Usually this was their father, but I believe that gave other options if people could not provide that information. They also wrote down the names, and I don't have this listed here, of their best friend. And lastly, they utilized a very famous individual at the time named Walter Cronkite, who, for those of you that need context, was a very popular newscaster that everybody sort of knew the name of, but didn't know much personal information about. After compiling this information, Jones and Nesbitt paired these names up with random events. Things like you got into a fist fight with your neighbor, you got caught speeding on the highway, your neighbor didn't do well, your family member didn't do well on a test. Walter Cronkite, was jaywalking on the street. Obviously, I just gave a bunch of negative examples, but they also, in this study, included more neutral examples and even a couple positive things. And what they asked people to do after reading these statements was try to figure out why these things would have occurred. And what they found was this very robust actor-observer effect, where when people described the behaviors of themselves, almost everything was attributed to the situation or some type of constraint that led them to do what they did. When they were judging the behaviors of Walter Cronkite, somebody they did not know at all personally, almost every behavior of Walter Cronkite's, good, negative, neutral, whatever it was usually attributed to him. People were, in essence, making those internal attributions that we talked about earlier with the fundamental attribution error. There's one other thing to note here, which is kind of neat, and that's the fact that when people were describing the actions of their friends and their family members, they oftentimes were sort of split on the explanations they gave. There was some estimates from Jones and Nesbitt that the degrees of separation from ourself has a determination or determinant on how much we blame a situation on the person and how much we blame a situation on the external factors. Now, to add to this complexity, others have talked about how maybe this is not only this kind of self-serving thing, but also potentially this thing that could be related to just our perception and how we have at our disposal kind of lots of explanations for why we might do the things we would do. We don't necessarily have them as much for distant others. We're kind of split on people that we're semi-close with, like family members or friends. Now, what makes this actor-observer effect all the more interesting, though, is another effect that's sort of a subtopic within it, something called the self-serving attribution bias, or sometimes you'll see it listed as you see in this slide, the self-serving bias, where we do tend to usually commit the actor-observer effect for all neutral and negative things, but when we're describing positive things, we do sometimes reserve the right to make, in that case, internal attributions for the cause of those things. Like, let's say you did poorly on an exam. Well, in that case, you would likely, especially if you're from a Western culture, blame these things on the teacher, the questions that you're encountering, the amount of time you had to study, maybe the distractions that your roommate or somebody else was providing while you were taking the test. But if you did well on the test, this self-serving attribution bias would suggest that you'd probably attribute that success to yourself, indicating that it's a mark of your intelligence or your ability to process this information, not the fact that it was just easy questions or there wasn't as much information that you had to remember or maybe you had some assistance. It's usually something that you somehow attribute to yourself in those situations. And this is something that has kind of gained a lot of traction and interest over the years, kind of looking at how this impacts us and why this comes about. And what's really interesting is people have shown that there are exceptions to even these actor-observer effects and self-serving biases. Cultural studies have shown that these things are sometimes switched around in some societies. Clinical research has suggested that not everybody commits a self-serving bias in the United States. In fact, those diagnosed with anxiety and depression issues can sometimes actually see a reversal of this. And also, when we get to age differences, we see that young kids and even older adults sometimes don't always commit these types of biases. But the fact that we see them and the fact that they are very common across a large number of individuals again gives us a really interesting sense of how our interpretation of others might be different from our interpretations of ourselves. And as social psychologists, many individuals try to tease apart these things and not only understand where there's maybe exceptions to them, but what explains them in the first place. And this is actually where we're going to close out. Sort of this open-ended place where we can go a bunch of different directions because honestly, that's what social psychology is all about. But just to reiterate, what we've focused on here when introducing ourselves to social psychology is this topic of what's called social perception. We've covered a lot about how we form perceptions about people, either individuals or groups, or maybe even ourselves. And we've talked about when and kind of the catalyst behind these types of things. And hopefully, from covering these things, you've had your interest picked a little bit in social psychology, and you might be able to explore some more current things that examine these topics, and you'll have a better grasp of what a social psychologist might do when we get into our next topics of discussion, which focus a little bit more on group dynamics and how we interact with the world around us. But for today, I think we're probably at a pretty good closing spot. So in the next class, be ready when we start talking about this really interesting topic called social influence. But be sure before you get to that point that you've reviewed everything from the book, you're ready to go, and you're prepared to learn about some very interesting topics about how your behaviors, not just your interpretations of the world, are impacted by the social world around you. I'll see you then.